They peered out. Before them was another cavernous hall. It was loftier and far longer than the one in which they had slept. They were near its eastern end. Westward it ran away into darkness. Down the center stalked a double line of towering pillars. They were carved like boles of mighty trees, whose boughs upheld the roof with a branching tracery of stone. Their stems were smooth and black, but a red glow was darkly mirrored in their sides. Right across the floor, close to the feet of two huge pillars, a great fissure had opened. Out of it, a fierce red light came, and now and again flames licked at the brink and curled about the bases of the columns. Wisps of dark smoke wavered in the hot air.
If we had come by the main road down to the upper halls, we should have been trapped here,
said Gandalf.
Let us hope that the fire now lies between us and pursuit. Come! There is no time to lose!
Even as they spoke, they heard again the pursuing drum beat. Do, do, do. Away beyond the shadows at the western end of the hall, there came cries and horn calls. Do, do. The pillars seemed to tremble and the flames to quiver.
Now, for the last race,
said Gandalf.
If the sun is shining outside, we may still escape. After me!
He turned left and sped across the smooth floor of the hall. The distance was greater than it had looked. As they ran, they heard the beat and echo of many hurrying feet behind. A shrill yell went up. They had been seen. There was a ring of clash of steel. An arrow whistled over Frodo's head. Boromir laughed.
They did not expect this,
he said.
The fire has cut them off. We're on the wrong side.
Look ahead!
Called Gandalf.
The bridge is near. It is dangerous and narrow.
Suddenly Frodo saw before him a black chasm. At the end of the hall, the floor vanished and fell to an unknown depth. The outer door could only be reached by a slender bridge of stone, without curb or rail, that spanned the chasm with one curving spring of 50 feet. It was an ancient defense of the dwarves against any enemy that might capture the first hall and the outer passages. They could only pass across it single file. At the brink, Gandalf halted, and the others came up in a pack behind.
Lead the way, Gimli,
he said.
Pippin and Merry next. Straight on, and up the stair, beyond the door.
Arrows fell among them. One struck Frodo and sprang back. Another pierced Gandalf's hat and stuck there like a black feather. Frodo looked behind. Beyond the fire, he saw swarming black figures. There seemed to be hundreds of orcs. They brandished spears and scimitars, which shone red as blood in the firelight. Doom, doom, rolled the drum beats, growing louder and louder. Doom, doom. Legolas turned and set an arrow to the string, though it was a long shot for his small bow. He drew, but then his hand fell, and the arrow slipped to the ground. He gave a cry of dismay and fear. Two great trolls appeared. They bore great slabs of stone and flung them down to serve as gangways over the fire. But it was not the trolls that had filled the elf with terror. The ranks of the orcs had opened, and they crowded away as if they themselves were afraid. Something was coming up behind them. What it was could not be seen. It was like a great shadow, in the middle of which was a dark form. Of man-shape maybe, yet greater. And a power and terror seemed to be in it, and go before it. It came to the edge of the fire, and the light faded as if a cloud had bent over it. Then with a rush it leaped across the fissure. The flames roared up to greet it, and wreathed about it, and the black smoke swirled in the air. Its streaming mane kindled and blazed behind it. In its right hand was a blade like a stabbing tongue of fire, and in its left it held a whip of many thongs.
Hi! Hi! A Balrog! A Balrog has come!
Gimli stared with wide eyes.
Durin's bed!
He cried, letting the axe fall. He covered his face.
A Balrog,
muttered Gandalf.
Now I understand.
He faltered and leaned heavily on his staff.
What an evil fortune. And I am already weary.
The dark figure streaming with fire raced towards them. The orcs yelled and poured over the stone gangways. Then Boromir raised his horn and blew. Loud the challenge rang and bellowed, like the shout of many throats under the cavernous roof. For a moment the orcs quailed and the fiery shadow halted. Then the echoes died as suddenly as a flame blown out by a dark wind, and the enemy advanced again.
Over the bridge!
Cried Gandalf, recalling his strength.
Fly! This is a foe beyond any of you! I was holding that away! Fly!
Aragorn and Boromir did not heed the command, but still held their ground, side by side, behind Gandalf at the far end of the bridge. The others halted just within the doorway at the hall's end, and turned, unable to leave their leader, to face the enemy alone. The Balrog reached the bridge. Gandalf stood in the middle of the span, leaning on the staff in his left hand, but in his other hand Glandring gleamed, cold and white. His enemy halted again, facing him, and the shadow about it reached out like two vast wings. It raised the whip, and the thongs whined and cracked. Fire came from its nostrils, but Gandalf stood firm.
You cannot pass,
he said. The orcs stood still, and a dead silence fell.
I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arnor. You cannot pass! The dark fire will not avail you! Flame of Ultun! Go back to the shadow! You cannot pass!
He said. The orcs stood still. The Balrog made no answer. The fire there seemed to die, but the darkness grew. It stepped forward slowly onto the bridge, and suddenly it drew itself into a great height, and its wings were spread from wall to wall. But still Gandalf could be seen, glimmering in the gloom. He seemed small, and altogether alone, grey and bent, like a wizened tree before the onset of a storm. From out of the shadow a red sword leaped flaming. Gandring glittered white in answer. There was a ringing flash, and a stab of white fire. The Balrog fell back, and its sword flew up in molten fragments. The wizard swayed on the bridge, stepped back a pace, and then again stood still.
You cannot pass!
He said. With a bound, the Balrog leaped full upon the bridge. Its whip whirled and hissed.
He cannot stand alone!
Cried Aragorn suddenly, and ran back along the bridge.
Khazad-Dûm!
He shouted.
I am with you, Gandalf! Gondor!
Cried Boromir and leaped after him. At that moment Gandalf lifted his staff, and crying aloud he smote the bridge before him. The staff broke asunder and fell from his hand. A blinding sheet of white flame sprang up. The bridge cracked. Right at the Balrog's feet it broke, and the stone upon which it stood crashed into the gulf, while the rest remained, poised, quivering like a tongue of rock thrust out into emptiness. With a terrible cry, the Balrog fell forward, and its shadow plunged down and vanished. But even as it fell, it swung its whip, and the tongs lashed and curled about the wizard's knees, dragging him into the brink. He staggered and fell, grasped vainly at the stone, and slid into the abyss. He cried, and was gone. The fires went out, and blank darkness fell. The company stood rooted with horror, staring into the pit. Even as Aragorn and Boromir came flying back, the rest of the bridge cracked and fell. With a cry, Aragorn roused them.
Come! I will lead you now!
He called.
We must obey his last command. Follow me!
They stumbled wildly up the great stairs beyond the door, Aragorn leading, Boromir at the rear. At the top was a wide, echoing passage. Along this they fled. Frodo heard Sam at his side weeping, and then he found that he himself was weeping as he ran. Doom, doom, doom. The drum beats rolled behind, mournful now and slow. They ran on. The light grew before them. Great shafts pierced the roof. They ran swifter. They passed into a hall, bright with daylight from its high windows in the east. They fled across it. Through its huge broken doors they passed, and suddenly before them the great gates opened, an arc of blazing light. There was a guard of orcs crouching in the shadows behind the great doorposts, towering on either side. But the gates were shattered and cast down. Aragorn smote to the ground the captain that stood in his path, and the rest fled in terror of his wrath. The company swift past them and took no heed of them. Out of the gates they ran and sprang down the huge and age-worn steps, the threshold of Moria. Thus, at last, they came beyond hope under the sky and felt the wind on their faces. They did not halt until they were out of bowshot from the walls. Dimril Dale lay about them. The shadow of the misty mountains lay upon it. But eastwards there was a golden light on the land. It was but 1 hour after noon. The sun was shining. The clouds were white and high. They looked back. Dark yawned the archway of the gates under the mountain shadow. Faint and far beneath the earth rolled the slow drum beats. Doom. A thin black smoke trailed out. Nothing else was to be seen. The dale all around was empty. Doom. Grief, at last, wholly overcame them, and they wept long. Some standing and silent, some cast upon the ground. The drum beats faded.